You're listening to the Culture Junkie Podcast, where we go beyond the surface of pop culture.
I'm Keith.
And I'm Xandra. Together, we dive into the craft process and passion that drive today's creators. This is the Culture Junkie Podcast. Life moves fast and your insurance should too. With on-the-fly insurance, you can compare rates, customize your coverage, and get a quote in minutes. It's 100% online, 100% secure, and 100% Canadian. So whether you're on the go or planning ahead, protect what matters most with ease. Head to ontheflyinsurance.com and get protection made easy. Built for life on the fly. Links in the bio or in the show notes below.
Hey,
Okay.
happy Wednesday. We're here with Ian Harvey, friend of mine. I've known Ian for over 20 years. Started the conversation playing soccer back in an old league in probably around 2002. Ian played for a horrible bunch of guys. They were all journalists and that, and I played for a bunch of fine, upstanding gentlemen. And anyway, we came into contact then, and we've been mates ever since. Anyway, listen, I'm here to talk about Ian's book. Ian, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. I always like to talk about publishing.
Excellent. Yeah. So your new book's called Prisoners of Circumstance, a South Scarborough Story. The core elements of the book, it follows a guy, a journalist, Roger Williams, battling addiction. He's 419 days sober. I see what you did there. It mixes truth and fiction. Themes include addiction, personal demons, crime, the gritty underbelly of life, and it's based in Scarborough. If you're from Toronto, you know all about Scarborough. Anyway, first of all, career highlights. Ian, you were 23 years in daily newspapers.
I was. And then another 20 years freelancing for newspapers and magazines and writing video scripts and then doing a little bit of marketing. I sort of retired writing a couple of books. The last book that I wrote before the novel was a nonfiction book for Sutherland House, and it was it's called Terry and Me, the inside story of the Terry Fox's Marathon of Hope. And it was co-written with my very good friend of 35 years, Bill Viggers, who was the Cancer Society guy that was sent out to go on the run with Terry and who figured out that he needed to make it blow up big across the country. And Bill, being the expert publicist that he was, made it so. And that's how Terry became the only reason. But Bill had a big hand in bringing the story to the public eye, as it were.
For sure. Also, our mutual friend, Gail Harvey, is the one who took the iconic picture. Gail Harvey, no relation. Yeah, Gail's been on our podcast, Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. So, your reporting background seems to have had a kind of an influence on your realism and the noir aspect of your writing, eh?
Yeah, because when I was working at The Sun, I covered crime and courts and law and justice and all those kinds of things. And then even when I was freelancing, I used to write for the Law Times and wrote a column for them about legislation at Queen's Park that was pending or had just been passed, or discussions that were going on. And so I was always dealing with the law and how it works. And a lot of that was criminal law. And it's always been a fascinating area. I've, hung out with cops and went out with the former MP, Bill Blair, who was in the cabinet and has just resigned to go as a high commissioner to England. Before he was chief of police at Toronto, he was a sergeant in the drug squad, Central Drugs.
Mhm.
And back in '89, I went out and bought crack cocaine with him just to show that it was in the city.
Of course, you and the former mayor just buying it for just to prove a point. I hear what you're doing. I see you.
No, not the mayor, the chief of police.
No, he wasn't the only one. I remember the former mayor was into the crack cocaine. Surely
Right,
you remember
I'm
that.
sorry. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
Exactly.
no, Blair was
Anyway.
a sergeant in the drug squad, and then later became chief of police, and then later my
Excellent.
MP.
Okay, so your freelance career, you said, started around 2004. Who did you write for? Was it the Globe, the Star, National Post?
My
all of
first
those?
assignment was a story about the summer that was in September 2004 for the National Post, for the Toronto section of the National Post. And then I just started hustling stories and making contacts. And then just before Christmas, I hooked up with Reader's Digest because I knew the incoming editor. I'd worked with him before. And so I gave him a call and he said, yeah, I'd love to have you write for me. And next thing I knew, I had a great run with Reader's Digest.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So I know you've also done a bunch of corporate communications and media training. That's going to get beyond your journalism. How's that helped in your writing?
Well, you have to look at both sides of the ledger, right? And I think understanding how people see the media and how they interact with the media and helping them interact with the media gives you great insight into many, many things, especially corporate structure. Like at the Sun, when I worked in newspapers and when I freelanced, you don't really know much about corporate structure. You don't really deal with it unless you're reporting on, shareholder meetings or, share prices, that kind of thing. When I went to Air Miles and I started working there, building up their website, I really didn't know much about marketing and I didn't know much about corporate structure. So that gave me a lot of insight into, there was a lot of knowledge gap in terms of how to deal with the media. People often afraid of the media. In fact, if the media calls you up and asks you for a comment or wants to interview you or talk about your company for a story, it's a gift. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift to get your story out there. And so you should always be prepared to tell your story. And I ended up helping people tell their stories. That's what I ended up doing. I mean, I told their stories or helped tell their stories as a journalist, and working in media training, I helped them tell their stories directly.
So you find that once you were through with them, they felt more comfortable blowing their own horn, so to speak, or is it just a kind of thing where everyone's afraid to say, "Oh, I'm really good at this particular thing"?
No, I think what I gave them was the confidence to talk about themselves and their business and then their vision for the business. And I think that once they have that confidence, and I don't know about you, but I think most people hate seeing themselves on a screen or listening to themselves on a recording. And that's a huge ick factor for many, many people. And so one of the things that I did or do, I don't do it anymore, but one of the things I did was I would set up a camera and I would interview them as if it was a real life story. And then we would play it back. And usually it's a group setting. So everybody would see it. And the person, of course, is cringing. And then we go, no, it's okay. You did great. This is what you do. And this is how you did it. And it was fantastic. And they can see. And if they made a mistake, it's a safe space, right? They can make a mistake. And then we can say, no. If you ever get asked that kind of question again, here's how you handle it. So someone says something to you and you don't know the answer, you don't freeze. You just say, you know what?
Oof,
I don't know the answer to
I don't
that,
know
but I will
that.
get back to you.
Absolutely. That comes across, right? As long as you are being honest and forthright with your answers and it's a natural flow of a conversation, I don't think you're hiding anything. It's when you go like this and then you go, I'd rather not speak to or whatever, then it comes across as disingenuous. But if someone says, hey, what do you think about such and such? And you go, phew, I never thought about that. I really couldn't answer you. That's authentic. That's an authentic response.
And that's the word, authentic.
Hmm. Listen, we've overcome a lot just doing this kind of thing. The other thing you do is I know you're a traveler. You do extensive global traveling. You write about adventure. Yeah, I know you do. You're scuba diver. Gourmet dining. You like a lot of cultural exploration. How'd you get into all that stuff?
Well, you probably know, but I'll tell everybody. I was born in England, and then when I was about 3, we went to Japan. And on the way, we stopped off in Karachi to see my grandparents because my dad was born in India, what was India at the time he was born there, before partition in 48. And then we went on to Japan. I lived in Japan for 5 years. And then we came back. And as we came back, we came on a slow boat and we stopped off all these exotic places along the way, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on. And then got back to England, lived in England. And then, when I was about 16, 17, we came to Canada because my dad was an engineer and there wasn't a lot of work there for him because the economy was not good. And so I ended up in Canada. But, I've lived all around the world. I speak Spanish a little bit and speak a little French. And so I've always been open to other cultures. And one of the ways you experience that, of course, is traveling, but, food, language, and other cultural pursuits. I mean, I think the world is a smorgasbord, and you just need to keep helping yourself to what's out there to experience it, because if you don't, you're missing out.
You were a reporter for decades, covering crime. How did that shape the book's tone and realism?
Well, there were murders in this neighborhood, right, over the years. I mean, I won't go into details of every one of them, but there were murders, and it's always interesting when a murder happens in your backyard. It becomes much more personal. And also because, they say, oh, you should write about what you know. Well, I've
Right.
written 3 novels before this, and none of them ever got published. None of them even got picked up. And I mean, the first one I think was pretty awful. The second one I think was a good story, but just didn't go anywhere. And the third one was, didn't get published. But that's what happens, right? But this one, I had this idea about prisons of circumstance, which is we're all of us a prisoner of circumstance in some ways. My circumstance is that I'm getting older, and because I'm getting old, there are many things I can't do anymore. So I'm imprisoned by that, in effect, in a literal sense. And there are other people that I've known and met and sort of followed, and they have their own prison, as it were. I mean, a reformed alcoholic is a prisoner of that circumstance, trying to recover and stay sober and rebuild their life. And so there are other characters in the book, and each character in the book, in their own way, sometimes more subtle than others, are a prisoner of their own circumstance, trying to break free.
So that's cool. That shows a lot of motivation, a lot of areas to go, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you could probably explore the different characters in a different novel, seeing, it is a story about the neighborhood kind of thing. I mean, also you've seen the justice system up close, right? So you know how it works with this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and the opening scene in the book is the scene of a beloved variety store owner. I have been to those scenes so many times where, the flowers and candles and the cars and the people gather to share their grief. And I've seen that so many times, and unless you've seen it up close and you've experienced it, it's quite something to see and experience. So I sort of started there and then sort of tied it into the other phenomenon that's going along Kingston Road here in South Scarborough, which is the March of the Condominiums. And when there's condominiums there, there's always money. And when there's big money, well, crime isn't always too far behind, and organized crime likes to use big projects to launder money. So that became one of the themes of the book.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's set in South Scarborough, the fancy end of Scarborough. You can see the beach from there. You can't see Lamoureux Collegiate from there, but this neighborhood is your neighborhood, right? And let's face it, people say that's the fancy end of Scarborough. North end of Scarborough is where all the quote unquote crime happens, So this has been your neighborhood for probably
45 years. Yeah.
45 years. So that neighborhood is carried through your life as an adult, and that's obviously influenced your writing, eh?
Yeah, because I know my theory about stories, especially fiction, is that it's a combination of components, and that's the characters, the plot, and I believe the time. If is it science fiction or is it contemporary, and then the last one is the place. Where does this all take place? So the neighborhood itself is as much a character as the protagonist and the antagonist.
Obviously, it will strike a lot of chords with people from the city who read the book, or even if you're vaguely familiar with Toronto, because it's a real place and they're real places. You can say, oh, I was by the Green Dragon, and people know exactly where you were. You say you're Balsam in the beach, or you're near the lion on the beach, people know that, and that adds not a tinge, that adds a great deal of realism to whatever you're doing.
So you're exactly right. The book is a mixture of fiction and reality. And so that some of the characters are composites and fictional, but they're all based on real characters, people that I have met and known or observed. And the places, I think, are important because they give that air of realism to the backdrop. And so there is a Buster's pub, and there is a coffee shop, and there is a library, and there is a variety store in the heart of all this. And there was a variety store where everybody knew the guy who ran it. And so I built the character around many of the similar traits of the variety store owner. The guy that knew every kid in the neighborhood and watched them grow up, right. I mean. The guy that would, if you were 10 cents short for a candy bar, would say, don't worry about it. I'll get you next time.
Let's talk about the protagonist. He's got an addiction arc. How much of that comes from real people you've met, and why'd you decide to tackle the addiction so directly as this one of the central themes in the novel?
Well, the protagonist is a recovering alcoholic and drug user who destroyed his own life because he couldn't cope with the aftermath of his mother's murder, which was quite gruesome. And so he hasn't been able to come back to the neighborhood because it brings back too many demons. But the murder of the variety store owner, who actually saved his life at one point, found him drunk and passed out in the churchyard one night, and in a freezing cold night, and dragged him back to the store and put him in the back room and sobered him up. He's never forgotten that. So he's made it a pilgrimage or a quest to go out and do what he can to shake up things so that this murder isn't forgotten and that somehow justice must prevail.
That's amazing. I love that. I love that motivational aspect of it. So tell me something about yourself here, though. I mean, you transitioned from being a journalist to writer of fiction. How did that come about, and how does that? What's the difference, or what's the same?
Well, many people would have said that my best work as a journalist was fiction, but I would disagree with them. No, fiction, because I've always loved fiction. I grew up, when I was a kid, I was bullied in school because I am different from many people, and you know that, right? I don't have a filter. I say what I think. I don't care if people don't like it. I just say it. And I was like that as a kid. So instead of dealing with the playground, I'd just go to the library and I would read. I would read everything I got my hands on. And that was me all through life. I loved science fiction, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, all this stuff. And then I started reading, I got into noir. Elmer
Hmm.
Leonard, Raymond Chandler, all these writers that have that staccato style of writing and explore the seamy underbelly of neighborhoods or communities or cities or whatever, cops
Hmm.
and criminals and everybody in between. I always wanted to, I never, none of my other efforts were along those lines, but I always loved that kind of noir fiction. And it's not very popular these days, but I always wanted to bring it back. And that's one of the things about publishing is that, genres go in and out of fashion. Skirts are long 1 week or 1 year, and then they're short, and then they're in between. And so publishing is somewhat like that for fiction. And now fiction publishing is so fragmented. There's chick lit, there's literature, there's crime, there's, romance, and, bodice rippers and all these other genres. Fantasy, medieval times, kind of, historic fantasy and romance. There are so many of them. And of course, you've got your Tom Clancy's and the war,
Sure.
the battle, the Jack Reacher series, and they do quite well. You've got John Grisham, and his law, the stories about law and law firms. The Firm, for example, The Client. These are all great novels. And so I wanted to write about something that I had sort of experienced that mixed a little bit of my experience in journalism and knowing about financial crime, because I did cover financial crime for a while,
Oh,
and blend that into my neighborhood, and which is where these condos are going. And so I just sort of started spinning this idea around. I talked to my daughter about it, and she got really excited because she thought she could help me create some of the characters, drawing on her experience growing up in Scarborough. And so it became something that we sort of talked about over wine on the deck. And I came up with this concept of prisoners of circumstance. And then one day I just sketched it out, and then I started writing.
that's amazing. That's amazing. So did you find that that fiction gives you a kind of a freedom that you didn't have in journalism? You can just really do what you want to tell your story.
Indeed, when you're telling stories in journalism, generally speaking, you're telling other people's stories, unless you're writing a first-person experience story. Like I went out and drove Ferraris in Tuscany on a junket, right? That was pretty cool, but it's not really my story. I'm telling somebody, it's something. It's an experience that I had. When you are in control of almost every facet of the story, except perhaps the neighborhood, because there are certain fixtures that you have to include. Kingston Road is the main road, right? Warden Avenues are, you weave that as through sort of the structural steel around which the facade of the story is built.
Nice. You're a writer. Structural steel.
You could say.
So you've had a long career arc. Let's face it, we're old guys now, right? You went from newspapers to freelancer to a novelist. Tell me something. What did you learn along the way? What was a major lesson that you took?
I think the major lesson that I took that I'm trying to impart to my kids is that you have to have a purpose in life. And so that purpose changes at your stage of life. And so, when you're a kid going to school, what's your purpose? Well, your purpose is to learn and to grow and to understand what's going on in the world around you. But when you get out of school and you start working, you've got to have a purpose, and you've got to have a purpose that you enjoy getting out of bed to pursue. And if you
Mhm.
don't enjoy getting out of bed to pursue your purpose in life, find another purpose, really.
So that being said, then what finally pushed you to publish?
Well, I wrote the book and I finished it about 2 years ago, and I put it around to agents and publishers, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And so they don't even reply because publishing these days is in a dire state. There was the publisher of Sutherland House, which is a publishing house. They only do nonfiction. They do nonfictional books. They did two of my books. They did the Terry Fox book and a book about the founding of LIUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, the biggest construction local in North America here in Toronto. The guy who founded it was an Italian immigrant who came here classic story, $5
Mhm.
in his pocket, that kind of thing. Those books did very well, but that doesn't get me any recognition in the world of fiction. And, as Ken White, who's the president of Sutherland, has noted recently, and in fact, there was a former CBC executive just written a book about the dire state of publishing in Canada. We don't do very well telling our own stories. We don't tell
Right.
there's very little money for nonfiction, and there's almost no money for fiction. Unless you have a name, unless, Stephen Harper decided to write a fictional account of a murder at Parliament Hill, you're not going to get much of a look.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that. Speaking of look, you ever think of writing for a screen? Ever think of television, movies, that kind of thing?
Yep. I wrote a script once for a movie called
What was that
Offside.
about?
It was about a cop who goes undercover to penetrate a bike gang that's involved in guns and narcotics. But it gets in so deep that his colleagues start to think that he's gone offside, that he's crossed over, but he hasn't. He's just trying to maintain his cover. And so that becomes the tension between his handlers and him wanting to save his life and finish the case and bring the bikers to justice.
There you go. That's a Scarborough story. Bikers,
Yeah, could be.
Scarborough, the Peelers. You'd have everything. That'd be a bestseller. So, it's really interesting to hear you say that you've taken this path and you've had these opportunities. Like, one thing though, before we wrap up here. So it's 2026. Who's going to win the World Cup? Are we going to win? We as
We,
England.
England, meaning
Yes,
England.
we England.
You and I are torn, obviously, because, we live in Canada and we have done for a number of years. And as much as I love Canada and I love the Canadian men's national football team, I don't think they have much of a chance of winning it. I hope they get into the knockout rounds, but
Mm.
I think England has a real chance. But it's World Cup, and you win by not making mistakes and not taking too much risk, unfortunately. And they're not always the most exciting games.
I tell everyone the same thing. Being an England fan is like being a Leaf fan. Every year, every time it rolls around, you think you're going to win. You got all the things going on, and then the bottom falls out, and you go, ugh. So, you know what? I would love for Canada to do well, but it's not expected. Just like the Leafs every year, England fans think we're going to win Euros, we're going to bring it home, we're going to do whatever, and then something happens. They're getting close, solid foundation now, and we'll see what happens. Anyway, Ian, thank you so much for this.
Thanks,
Great
Keith.
seeing you. Like the
Good
tie.
seeing you.
An interesting story, and that's right. Anyway, and we'll be talking again. Maybe we'll chat over the World Cup. Come on my sportscast.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
right.
Love to talk. I talk football day and night, 24 hours a day. You know that.
All right. It's a date. We'll do that.
Listen,
Talk to you
thanks, man. You
soon.
take care.